The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was one of the most shocking geopolitical events of the 20th century, an event that reshaped global power structures, ended the Cold War, and left millions searching for answers. For decades, the USSR had projected an image of strength, permanence, and ideological certainty. It was a superpower that rivaled the United States, sent humans into space, possessed the largest nuclear arsenal on Earth, and controlled nearly 1/6 of the planet's landmass. To the outside world, the Soviet Union appeared unbreakable. Yet behind the parades, propaganda posters, and red flags lay an economic system under immense strain, one slowly suffocating under its own contradictions. This documentary explores the real reasons the Soviet Union collapsed, not through dramatic battlefield defeats or sudden political coups, but through the quiet, grinding failure of its economic foundations. While ideology, leadership struggles, and external pressure played important roles, it was economics, inefficiency, stagnation, mismanagement, and systemic rigidity that ultimately killed the USSR. Understanding this collapse is not only about understanding Soviet history, it is about understanding how economic systems shape nations, determine political outcomes, and decide whether empires survive or fall. To understand why the Soviet Union collapsed, we must return to the origins of its economic system. Born out of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, the Soviet economy was designed as a complete rejection of capitalism. Private property was abolished, markets were replaced by central planning, and the state became the sole owner of land, factories, and resources. The idea was revolutionary. Instead of profit guiding production, human need would. In theory, this system promised equality, stability, and rapid industrial growth. And in its early decades, it delivered impressive results. The USSR transformed from a largely agrarian society into an industrial powerhouse within a single generation. Massive factories rose across the landscape, illiteracy was eradicated, and the Soviet Union emerged victorious from World War II at an unimaginable human cost. However, the very structure that allowed rapid mobilization during crisis became a liability during peacetime. Central planning required millions of decisions to be made by bureaucrats far removed from reality. 5-year plans dictated production targets without understanding local conditions, consumer demand, or technological efficiency. Factories focused on meeting quotas rather than producing quality goods. Innovation was discouraged because failure threatened political punishment. Over time, inefficiencies multiplied, resources were wasted, supply chains broke down, and corruption flourished. The Soviet economy became excellent at producing tanks, steel, and missiles, but terrible at producing consumer goods, food variety, and modern technology. While the system survived through coercion and control, the seeds of collapse were already planted deep within its economic design. By the 1950s and 1960s, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. Leaders like Nikita Khrushchev attempted reforms, recognizing that the economy could not continue functioning as it had under Stalin. Khrushchev decentralized some planning, invested in agriculture, and sought to improve living standards. However, these reforms were inconsistent and often reversed. Later, under Leonid Brezhnev, the USSR entered a period now known as the era of stagnation. On the surface, life appeared stable. Employment was guaranteed, prices were controlled, and the state provided housing, education, and healthcare. But beneath this stability lay deep economic decay. Productivity growth slowed dramatically. Factories relied on outdated machinery. Scientific research existed, but civilian application lagged far behind the West. The rigid planning system could not adapt to technological change, particularly the computer revolution transforming Western economies. Meanwhile, the military consumed an enormous share of national resources. Competing with the United States in the arms race drained capital that could have modernized industry or improved living standards. Oil exports temporarily masked these problems during the 1970s, but when global oil prices fell in the 1980s, the Soviet economy lost its lifeline. Shortages became common. Citizens spent hours in queues for basic goods. Black markets expanded. Trust in the system eroded. The leadership aged, resisted change, and feared destabilization more than collapse. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, the Soviet economy was no longer merely inefficient, it was fundamentally broken. Gorbachev understood that the Soviet Union could not survive without reform. His policies of perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness, were meant to save socialism, not destroy it. He introduced limited market mechanisms, allowed small private enterprises, and reduced central control over production. However, these reforms came too late and were too contradictory. The old system was weakened, but a functioning market economy was never fully established. Enterprises lost state support but lacked market discipline. Prices remained controlled, causing massive shortages. State revenues collapsed while expenses remained high. At the same time, glasnost exposed decades of lies, failures, and corruption, shattering public faith in the Communist Party. Nationalist movements gained strength across the Soviet republics, fueled by economic grievances and resentment over resource distribution. Instead of revitalizing the economy, perestroika accelerated its disintegration. Inflation surged. Living standards fell sharply. The social contract, economic security in exchange for political obedience, was broken. For the first time, millions openly questioned whether the Soviet system could deliver a future at all. The turning point was not a single event, but a realization. The Soviet economy was no longer capable of sustaining the state. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was trapped in an economic death spiral. Industrial output declined, food shortages worsened, foreign debt increased, attempts to reform prices triggered panic buying and hoarding. The military-industrial complex resisted change, while ordinary citizens bore the cost of transition. The failed August 1991 coup by hardliners exposed how fragile the system had become. When the Soviet republics began declaring independence, Moscow lacked both the economic resources and political legitimacy to stop them. The planned economy had created dependency rather than resilience. Once central authority weakened, the entire structure collapsed. Unlike revolutions driven by mass uprisings, the Soviet collapse was quiet, bureaucratic, and devastating. On December 26, 1991, the USSR officially ceased to exist, not because it was conquered, but because it could no longer function. The collapse of the Soviet Union reshaped the world. 15 new nations emerged, many facing economic chaos, hyperinflation, and social collapse. Millions lost savings, jobs, and security overnight. Russia's transition to capitalism was brutal, marked by oligarchs, corruption, and declining life expectancy. Globally, the fall of the USSR marked the apparent triumph of market economies, but also served as a warning. The Soviet experiment showed that economic systems matter. Efficiency, adaptability, incentives, and transparency are not abstract concepts, they determine whether societies thrive or fail. The USSR did not collapse because its people lacked discipline or intelligence. It collapsed because its economic system could not evolve. This documentary is not just a story of the past, it is a lesson for the future. When economies stop serving people, when ideology replaces reality, and when reform is delayed too long, even the most powerful empires can fall.